November 11th, 1941. Pratt and Whitney Aircraft, East Hartford, Connecticut. Luke Hobbs stood in the test cell watching pressure gauges climb as the 18-cylinder R2-8008 engine roared to life for the first time. His hands gripped the observation rail, knuckles white, as the massive radial engine spun up to full power. The two-stage supercharger he'd spent 3 years developing was about to prove whether his unorthodox design philosophy could work. The auxiliary stage engaged with a mechanical whine barely audible over the engine's thunder. Manifold pressure held steady at 15,500 feet equivalent altitude, delivering 1,800 horsepower where conventional engines would gasp for air. This wasn't just another engine variant. This was the breakthrough that would determine whether American carrier fighters could match Japanese Zeros at altitude, whether pilots would have the power to climb fast enough to intercept, whether the Navy's next-generation fighter would dominate Pacific skies or become another victim of superior enemy performance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The first production R2-8008 engines were being crated for immediate delivery to Vought and Grumman. Within months, these power plants would transform American naval aviation, but the path to this moment had been anything but certain, and the decisions Luke Hobbs made in designing this supercharger system would prove as important as any tactical innovation or strategic plan in winning the air war over the Pacific. 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1938, Pratt and Whitney's engineering team faced a problem that threatened to make their newest engine obsolete before it even entered production. The R2800 Double Wasp, designed by Hobbs and George Meade starting in 1936, was America's first 18-cylinder radial engine. At 2,800 cubic inches of displacement, it promised unprecedented power from a relatively compact package. But power at sea level meant nothing if the engine couldn't maintain that output at altitude, where modern air combat was increasingly taking place. The prototype R2-8001, first tested in July 1939, used a single-speed two-stage supercharger that delivered 1,500 horsepower at 7,500 feet, respectable but inadequate. Combat reports from Europe showed fighters routinely engaging above 20,000 feet. The Japanese Zero, American intelligence suggested, could operate effectively even higher. A fighter engine needed to maintain power across a broad altitude range, from sea-level scrambles to high-altitude interceptions. Single-speed superchargers couldn't do that. The limitations were fundamental to the physics. A supercharger is essentially an air pump driven by the engine itself, compressing intake air before it enters the cylinders. At sea level, where air is already dense, a powerful supercharger could overboost the engine, causing detonation that would destroy pistons in minutes. At high altitude, where air is thin, that same supercharger might not compress enough to maintain power. Single-speed superchargers represented a compromise that satisfied neither requirement. Two-speed superchargers offered a partial solution. A clutch mechanism allowed switching between low and high gear ratios, optimizing performance for different altitudes. But even two-speed systems had limitations. The supercharger still compressed air only once, and physics dictated that a single compression stage could only achieve so much pressure increase before inefficiencies and heat became overwhelming problems. The answer, Luke Hobbs concluded, was two-stage supercharging with intercooling between stages. Compress the air once in a low-pressure stage, cool it to reduce temperature and increase density, then compress it again in a high-pressure stage. The concept wasn't new. Rolls-Royce and other European manufacturers had experimented with similar systems, but implementation in a radial engine designed for aircraft carrier operation presented unique challenges. Hobbs had joined Pratt and Whitney in the early 1930s after working at Bendix, where he designed injection carburetors. His background in fuel systems gave him insights other engineers lacked. He understood that supercharging wasn't just about pumping more air, it was about managing the entire intake system as an integrated whole, controlling temperatures, pressures, and flow rates to maximize power while preventing detonation. The two-stage supercharger design Hobbs proposed for the R2-8008 was mechanically complex but conceptually elegant. The main stage, driven directly by the engine through gearing, operated continuously at one of two speeds selected by the pilot. The auxiliary stage, mounted behind the main stage, could be clutched in or out depending on altitude. At low altitudes, only the main stage operated. Above approximately 11,000 feet, the auxiliary stage engaged automatically, providing the additional compression needed to maintain manifold pressure as atmospheric pressure decreased. Between the two stages sat dual air-to-air intercoolers, heat exchangers that used ram air from the aircraft's forward motion to cool the compressed air from the main stage before it entered the auxiliary stage. Cooling was critical. Compressing air generates tremendous heat. Every pound of boost pressure raised intake temperature by approximately 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Without intercooling, the air entering the engine would be so hot that detonation became inevitable, regardless of fuel octane rating. The intercoolers added weight, complexity, and installation challenges. They required ducting to bring cooling air to the heat exchanger cores and more ducting to route the cooled compressed air to the auxiliary stage. They increased the engine's frontal area slightly and demanded careful attention to airflow management. But the performance benefits justified every complication. Hobbs calculated that the two-stage system with intercooling could maintain rated power to 15,000 feet and deliver 1,800 horsepower at altitudes where single-stage engines would struggle to produce 1,200. That was a 50% power advantage at the altitudes where combat increasingly occurred. For fighter designers, that translated directly into climb rate, speed, and the ability to maintain energy in combat maneuvers at altitude. But calculations on paper meant nothing if the system couldn't be built reliably and produced in quantity. Pratt and Whitney's production engineers examined Hobbs's design with skepticism that bordered on hostility. The company had built its reputation on rugged, reliable radial engines that could take abuse and keep running. The proposed two-stage system looked like a maintenance nightmare. The clutch mechanism for engaging the auxiliary stage required precision manufacturing and careful adjustment. The intercoolers demanded exotic alloys and specialized welding techniques. The ducting between stages had to seal perfectly under pressure and temperature extremes. Any leak, any misalignment, any component failure could cause catastrophic engine damage, and all of this had to work in the harsh environment of carrier operations, with salt spray, humidity, temperature extremes, and maintenance by mechanics working on pitching decks in combat zones. Hobbs argued that complexity was acceptable if it delivered necessary performance. American industrial capacity could handle precision manufacturing. Training programs could teach mechanics to maintain sophisticated systems. What couldn't be overcome was insufficient power at altitude. Give pilots an engine that maintained 1,800 horsepower at 15,000 feet, and they'd accept whatever maintenance the system required. Give them an engine that wheezed and struggled at altitude, and no amount of simplicity would make up for being outclimbed and outrun by enemy fighters. The debate within Pratt and Whitney continued through 1939 and into 1940 as the war in Europe escalated and Japanese aggression in Asia grew more brazen. Combat reports from the Battle of Britain confirmed what Hobbs had been arguing. Fighters with superior high-altitude performance dominated those without it. The Spitfire, powered by Rolls-Royce Merlins with increasingly sophisticated supercharging, could meet German fighters at altitude. Earlier British fighters with less capable power plants had been slaughtered. By mid-1940, the decision was made. Pratt and Whitney would proceed with development of the R2-8008 with two-stage, two-speed supercharging and intercooling. The first prototype engines were already being assembled when the implications of that decision became dramatically clear. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. Among the aircraft decimating American forces were Mitsubishi A6M0s, fighters that combined exceptional range with the ability to operate effectively at altitudes above 20,000 feet. American F6F Wildcats, powered by Pratt and Whitney R1000, 830 engines with single-stage superchargers, were outperformed. The Zeros could climb faster, fight at higher altitudes, and maintain energy better than anything America fielded. 4 days after Pearl Harbor, on December 11th, the first production R2-8008 engines left the East Hartford facility, crated and ready for immediate installation in aircraft. The timing was almost miraculous. Had the war started 6 months earlier, before the 2-stage engines were ready for production, American fighters would have faced an even more desperate situation. The R2-8008 specifications were impressive on paper. 2,000 horsepower at 1,000 feet altitude, 1,800 horsepower at 15,500 feet. In the thin air at 15,000 feet, where atmospheric pressure is half that at sea level, maintaining 1,800 horsepower required the supercharger to compress intake air to pressures exceeding sea level density. The 2-stage system accomplished this, while keeping intake temperatures manageable through intercooling. The engine weighed 2,350 pounds dry, substantially heavier than the single-stage R2-8005 used in medium bombers. But the weight penalty bought performance that couldn't be achieved any other way. For Navy planners designing the next generation of carrier fighters to replace the outmatched Wildcat, the R2-8008 represented the foundation upon which superior aircraft could be built. Vought Aircraft was already flying the XF4U-1 Corsair prototype powered by an early R2800 variant. The sleek fighter with its distinctive inverted gull wings had demonstrated impressive speed, but further development would wait for the production R2-8008 engines. Grumman, Pratt and Whitney's longtime partner in naval aviation, was designing the F6F Hellcat specifically around the R2-8008's capabilities. The Hellcat design, finalized in early 1942, represented Grumman's philosophy of building fighters optimized for carrier operations and maintainable by the Navy's mechanics. Unlike the Corsair, which prioritized maximum speed even at the cost of some practicality, the Hellcat emphasized reliability, ease of maintenance, good visibility for the pilot, and docile handling characteristics that would make carrier landings safer for less experienced pilots. But underneath that pragmatic design philosophy was a powerplant that pushed technology to its limits. The R280010W, that would eventually power production F6F Hellcats, was a refined version of Hobbs's 2-stage design, incorporating water methanol injection for additional power. The W suffix denoted anti-detonant injection, a system that sprayed a mixture of water and methanol into the carburetor during high-power operations. The water absorbed heat, cooling the intake charge and allowing higher boost pressures without detonation. The methanol added combustible fuel to the mixture, partially offsetting the power loss from the water's cooling effect. With water injection, the R280010W could produce 2,250 horsepower for brief periods. But even in normal military power settings without water injection, the 2-stage supercharger gave the Hellcat the power to climb at 3,240 feet per minute initially and maintain climb performance well above 20,000 feet, where single-stage engines faltered. On June 26, 1942, Grumman test pilot Bob Hall lifted the XF6F1 prototype into the air for its first flight. The prototype used a Wright R2600 engine as the R2-8008 seconds were in short supply, but the airframe was already designed around the more powerful engine. 24 days later, on July 30th, Hall flew the XF6F3 powered by the R2-80010, essentially an R2-8008 with minor refinements. The performance was immediately apparent. The Hellcat climbed aggressively, the big radial engine pulling the fighter upward at rates that exceeded any Navy fighter in service. The massive 2-stage supercharger, visible as a bulge on the bottom of the engine, was doing exactly what Luke Hobbs had calculated it would do 3 years earlier. At altitude, where atmospheric pressure dropped and other engines lost power, the R2800 maintained output. The auxiliary stage automatically engaged, and manifold pressure held steady. Grumman's engineers monitoring the test flights recorded performance data that exceeded expectations. The F6F could reach 20,000 feet faster than the Zero could reach 15,000 feet. At 25,000 feet, where the Zero was near its performance limits, the Hellcat still had power in reserve. The implications for combat tactics were profound. American fighter doctrine in early 1942 emphasized survival. Wildcat pilots facing Zeros were taught to avoid turning fights, use diving attacks when possible, and disengage if the fight turned against them. It was the tactics of an inferior force making the best of bad circumstances. The Hellcat, Navy planners realized, could change that calculus entirely. With superior power at all altitudes, the F6F could dictate engagement terms. If American pilots wanted to fight, they could climb to altitude and force the engagement. If they wanted to disengage, superior power gave them the speed to escape. The Hellcat wouldn't outturn the Zero at low speeds. Physics dictated that the lighter, more maneuverable Japanese fighter would always have that advantage, but the American fighter wouldn't need to turn with it. Vertical maneuvers, using altitude and energy management, would become the Hellcat's domain. Production of F6F Hellcats began in October 1942, just 16 months after Pearl Harbor, and barely 4 years after Luke Hobbs began designing the two-stage Supercharger system. Grumman's massive Bethpage facility was already tooled for rapid production, and F6F Hellcats began rolling off assembly lines at rates that would have seemed impossible before the war. By January 1943, the first Hellcats reached fleet squadrons. Fighting Squadron 9, VF9, received the first operational Hellcats in February 1943 and embarked on USS Essex for training. Lieutenant Commander Philip Torrey, the squadron's commanding officer, put his pilots through intensive training focused on exploiting the Hellcat's strengths. Climb to altitude before engaging. Use speed and power to control the fight. Make diving attacks from above. Use altitude as your bank account. Spend it wisely, and rebuild it between engagements. Never let yourself be dragged into a slow-speed turning fight where the Zero's superior maneuverability dominated. The Hellcat's service ceiling of 37,300 feet, enabled by the two-stage Supercharger's ability to maintain power at extreme altitudes, gave American pilots a refuge Japanese fighters couldn't reach. At 35,000 feet, the Hellcat still had enough power to maneuver. The Zero at the same altitude was barely controllable, the engine producing perhaps 40% of its rated output, controls mushy, the aircraft on the edge of stalling. On August 31, 1943, Hellcats made their combat debut during strikes against Marcus Island. The results were everything Navy planners had hoped for. The F6Fs dominated the engagement. Japanese fighters that tried to intercept found themselves outclimbed and outrun. Hellcat pilots used the altitude advantage the two-stage Supercharger provided to position for attacks, dove on targets with speed that Japanese pilots couldn't match, and climbed away before defenders could respond. Over the following months, the Hellcat's performance advantages became increasingly apparent. Squadron after squadron reported the same patterns. The F6F could climb faster than enemy fighters, could fight effectively at altitudes where Japanese aircraft struggled, and could use power to escape any situation that turned unfavorable. The two-stage Supercharger, invisible to pilots but fundamental to every aspect of the aircraft's performance, was proving its worth with every engagement. The statistics told the story. By the end of 1943, Hellcats had achieved kill ratios exceeding 10-1 against Japanese fighters. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Hellcats and other American carrier aircraft destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese carrier air groups, rebuilt after devastating losses at Midway, were annihilated. Many factors contributed to American victory that day: numerical superiority, better pilot training, superior tactics, but fundamental to everything was the Hellcat's ability to operate effectively at altitude and maintain power throughout the combat envelope. Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu, flying with VF-16 from USS Lexington, shot down 6 Japanese dive bombers in 8 minutes during the Philippine Sea battle, bringing his total victories to 19, all in Hellcats. In his post-action report, Vrasiu noted that the F6F's climb rate allowed him to gain altitude advantage over the incoming Japanese strike, and the power at altitude let him make repeated diving attacks without losing position relative to the enemy formation. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. He never mentioned the supercharger. Pilots rarely thought about engine internals, but everything he accomplished depended on the two-stage system, maintaining power at the 20,000-foot altitude where the engagement occurred. By mid-1944, American carrier task forces operated with near impunity across the Pacific. Japanese air opposition, while still dangerous, was increasingly ineffective against the swarms of Hellcats that provided combat air patrol over the fleet. The F6F had become the dominant carrier fighter in the Pacific, and the engine that made it dominant was Luke Hobbs's two-stage supercharged R2800. The technical challenges Hobbs had solved were evident in every aspect of the engine's operation. The intercoolers, positioned to draw cooling air from the cowl opening, reduced compressed air temperature by more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit between the main and auxiliary stages. That cooling allowed the auxiliary stage to compress the air further without causing detonation, and it reduced the thermal stress on engine components. Without intercooling, the two-stage system would have torn itself apart within hours. The automatic engagement of the auxiliary stage, controlled by a simple mechanical linkage responding to intake manifold pressure, meant pilots didn't need to manage supercharger operation. The system engaged smoothly as altitude increased and disengaged during descent, all without pilot intervention. In combat, where pilots already managed throttle, propeller pitch, mixture, fuel tank selection, and dozens of other systems while simultaneously navigating, communicating, and fighting, automatic supercharger operation removed one more burden from already overloaded aviators. The reliability of the system, despite its complexity, validated Hobbs's engineering choices and Pratt and Whitney's manufacturing expertise. R2800 engines routinely ran for hundreds of hours between overhauls. They tolerated battle damage that would have destroyed less robust power plants. Mechanics in forward areas could maintain them with standard tools and training. The two-stage supercharger, which skeptics had predicted would be a maintenance nightmare, proved reliable enough for combat operations under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Production of R2800 engines in all variants eventually exceeded 125,000 units, making it one of the most produced aircraft engines in history. The two-stage supercharged versions, primarily the -8, -10, and later variants, powered not just the F6F Hellcat, but also the F4U Corsair, the P-61 Black Widow night fighter, and other aircraft critical to American air operations. Every one of those engines incorporated the fundamental supercharger design philosophy Luke Hobbs had established in the late 1930s. By war's end, F6F Hellcats had destroyed over 5,000 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, the highest total of any Allied fighter. The kill ratio, calculated at 19-1 overall and 13-1 specifically against Japanese Zeros, represented complete aerial dominance. Hundreds of factors contributed to that success: pilot training, tactical doctrine, numerical superiority, American industrial capacity, but underlying everything was an aircraft that could climb to altitude quickly and fight effectively once there. The service ceiling of 37,300 feet that Grumman advertised for the F6F5 was enabled entirely by the two-stage supercharger's ability to maintain engine power at extreme altitudes. At 35,000 feet, atmospheric pressure is approximately 1/4 of sea level pressure. For an engine to produce meaningful power at that altitude, the supercharger must compress intake air to 4 times atmospheric pressure just to replicate sea level conditions. To produce full rated power requires even higher compression ratios, pushing the limits of what mechanical superchargers could achieve. Luke Hobbs's achievement was understanding how to accomplish this within the constraints of a radial engine that had to fit in a carrier fighter's nose. The two-stage supercharger added approximately 300 pounds to the engine weight compared to single-stage variants. It increased frontal area slightly, adding drag. It required additional cooling airflow, which also created drag. But the power it provided at altitude more than compensated for these penalties, and the combat results proved the trade-offs were correct. Other nations attempted similar developments with varying success. Germany's Daimler-Benz DB 601 and 605 engines used mechanically driven superchargers, but German engineers never fielded two-stage systems as reliable as American designs. Japanese engine development focused on maximizing low-altitude performance and range, accepting reduced high-altitude capability as an acceptable compromise. The Nakajima Homare engine that powered late-war Japanese fighters was sophisticated and powerful at medium altitudes, but couldn't match American two-stage supercharged engines above 20,000 feet. British Rolls-Royce Merlin engines with two-stage, two-speed supercharging achieved performance comparable to American designs, but the Merlin's liquid cooling system added complexity and vulnerability that air-cooled radials avoided. The choice between liquid-cooled and air-cooled engines involved multiple trade-offs beyond supercharging, but for carrier operations, where battle damage tolerance and simplified maintenance were critical, the R2000 800's air-cooled design offered advantages that complemented the sophisticated supercharging system. The F6F introduced in late 1944, incorporated minor refinements to the basic Hellcat design, but retained the R2-80010W powerplant. The improvements included a redesigned engine cowling for better cooling, strengthened tail surfaces, and revised ailerons for better high-speed handling. The fundamental aircraft remained unchanged because the original design had proven so successful. When an aircraft works, when it accomplishes its mission effectively, when pilots trust it and mechanics can maintain it, changes risk introducing problems without delivering meaningful improvements. The Hellcat's climb rate of 3,240 feet per minute, measured under standard conditions, represented what the aircraft could achieve when properly operated. In combat conditions, with full internal fuel, ammunition, and the pilot's natural tendency to climb at higher speeds for better engine cooling and tactical flexibility, actual climb rates were somewhat lower but still impressive. The Hellcat could reach 20,000 feet in less than 7 minutes from brake release on the carrier deck. For combat air patrol operations, where the goal was to position fighters at altitude before incoming raids arrived, that climb performance was exactly what fleet defense required. The tactical flexibility the two-stage supercharger provided extended beyond pure climb rate. In combat, altitude equals energy, and energy equals options. A pilot with an altitude advantage can choose to engage or disengage. He can dive on an enemy below, building speed that translates into either a difficult target, to track, or energy to zoom back to altitude after the attack. He can remain above the fight, observing and waiting for the optimal moment to commit. All of these tactical options depended on having the power to gain and maintain altitude advantage. Japanese pilots, flying aircraft optimized for maneuverability at low to medium altitudes, found themselves in the unfamiliar position of being denied their preferred fighting environment. When Hellcats operated at 25 to 30,000 feet, Japanese fighters could climb to meet them only with great difficulty, and once at altitude, the Japanese aircraft had little power remaining for combat maneuvering. The physics of supercharging dictated that whoever could maintain power at altitude controlled the vertical dimension of combat, and the vertical dimension increasingly determined outcomes as the war progressed, and American pilots learned to exploit their aircraft's strengths. The R2000 800's two-stage supercharger influenced fighter design beyond the Hellcat and Corsair. When Grumman began designing the F6F Bearcat in 1943 as an even more capable successor to the Hellcat, the design team chose a single-stage supercharged R2800 variant to save weight for a lighter, smaller airframe. The Bearcat was intended for low to medium altitude combat in support of amphibious invasions, where extreme high-altitude capability was less important than raw climb rate and low-altitude speed. The design choice reflected hard-won understanding of how supercharging characteristics shaped aircraft performance and tactical employment. For the Hellcat, the two-stage supercharger's ability to maintain power at altitude was fundamental to the aircraft's combat role as a fleet defense fighter. Combat air patrol doctrine required fighters to orbit at altitude above the fleet for extended periods, ready to intercept incoming raids detected by shipboard radar. Operating at 25,000 feet for hours demanded an LS engine that could maintain power efficiently at altitude, and the R280010W did exactly that. Luke Hobbs never achieved the fame of fighter pilots, or even of some aircraft designers. His name appears in technical documents and engineering society papers, but rarely in popular histories. Yet his contribution to American air superiority in the Pacific was as significant as any tactical innovation or strategic decision. The two-stage supercharger system he designed and advocated for, against skepticism and institutional resistance, gave American fighters the power to dominate the vertical dimension of combat. When Bob Hall first flew the F6F with its R280010 engine in July 1942, he immediately recognized the aircraft's potential. In his post-flight report, Hall noted the strong climb rate and the engine's smooth power delivery across the altitude range. He probably never thought about the years of engineering work that had gone into the supercharger system, or the debates and calculations and test cell failures that preceded the polished production engine spinning in front of his cockpit. Pilots rarely think about such things. They judge an engine by how it performs, not how it achieves that performance. And the R2800 performed. Through 2 years of intensive combat operations across the Pacific, through carrier launches in tropical heat and Arctic cold, through battles that lasted hours and saw aircraft repeatedly climb to altitude, attacked, descended, and climbed again, the two-stage supercharged R2800-powered Hellcats that achieved the most dominant combat record of any American fighter in World War II. The final Hellcat rolled off Grumman's production line in November 1945, 3 months after Japan's surrender. Total F6F production reached 12,275 aircraft, all powered by R2800 engines, with two-stage supercharging. Pratt and Whitney built 46,000 R280010 and 10W engines for Hellcats and other aircraft, each one incorporating the fundamental design concepts Luke Hobbs had fought to prove viable. In the decades following the war, jet engines rendered piston power plants obsolete for high-performance fighters. The last production R2800 was built in 1960, and mechanical superchargers gave way to turbojets that didn't need them. But for the critical years from 1942 through 1945, when American carriers fought across the Pacific and American fighters had to dominate enemy aircraft to protect the fleet, the two-stage supercharged R2800 was exactly the engine that was needed. Luke Hobbs retired from Pratt and Whitney in the 1950s, having spent his entire career advancing aircraft engine technology. In technical papers and presentations to engineering societies, he occasionally discussed the development of the R2800 supercharging system, always emphasizing the team effort and the contributions of colleagues. Engineers tend to be modest about their achievements, crediting others and deflecting personal recognition. But the men who flew Hellcats in combat knew what made their aircraft effective. They knew the F6F could climb faster than enemy fighters, could fight at altitudes where Japanese aircraft struggled, could use power to escape unfavorable situations and control the terms of engagement. They trusted the big radial engine in the nose to deliver power when demanded, to keep running despite battle damage, to bring them home. 50 years after the war, when veterans gathered at reunions and air shows to see restored Hellcats fly, many commented on the sound of the R2800 at full power. The deep-throated roar of 18 cylinders, firing in sequence, the whine of the supercharger audible beneath the exhaust note, the steady drone as the aircraft climbed away, gaining altitude. It was a sound that meant reliability, power, and survival to men who had depended on it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.